the idea of struggling prayer. Those times when prayer feels like desperation. Scripture is full of examples of people who wrestled with God in prayer, and today we explore what it means to embrace that raw, honest side of prayer by focusing in particular on lament. The dictionary defines lament as a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. And it's not a word that we hear very often in today's world, and it's probably not a word that we're particularly comfortable experiencing. This morning I want to start by reading 3 laments to you. Your job is simply to soak them up. There may be something within one of them that really resonates for you. And then at the end we're going to see if you can identify the author of each lament. So lament number 1. Oh God, I don't know why I'm praying again, but I am. How long will I carry this grief, Lord? You said you're near to the brokenhearted, but you feel so far, so quiet. My prayers pile up like unopened letters. I've begged, I've waited, I've watched, and nothing changes. Speak, Lord, even if it's only a whisper. Remind me that you haven't forgotten me. I remember the prayers you have answered, so I will hold on to the stories of your faithfulness when I have no strength of my own. Though my heart is broken and my hope flickers, I will say again, you are my God, and I will wait for you. The second lament, which I may have shortened from what's written up there, but don't worry about that. In my heart, there is no faith, no love, no trust. There is just so much pain. The pain of longing, the pain of not being wanted. I want God with all the powers of my soul, and yet between us there is terrible separation. And I don't pray any longer. The place of God in my soul is blank. I just long and long for God. The torture and pain I can't explain. Oh Lord, show yourself to me, for there is such terrible darkness within me, as if everything was dead. And the third lament, God, where are you? How can my pain still resonate so deeply? How long must I struggle with anguish in my heart? I remember the days of deepest pain I experienced, and I'm afraid those thoughts will swamp me again. Every day is a struggle. Will I ever feel joy again? Will this feeling of emptiness ever leave me? And yet I sense your whisper, God, reminding me that you have my life in your hands. I belong to you. I cling to you. Help me to trust. One of those laments was written by Mother Teresa. One was written by me during a particularly tough period in my life. And one was written by ChatGPT. So now, I wonder if anyone can decide which one was written by Mother Teresa. I know it's probably quite hard to read. Has it already gone up? That's all right, go to the next slide. So Mother Teresa wrote that middle one. And I find it so interesting that someone who is known for her love and her compassion and her joy. You hardly ever see a photo of Mother Teresa without smiling. And yet, there was this darkness within her. No faith, no love, no trust, just so much pain. I don't know if you've ever experienced a time in your life where you could identify with any of those laments. But we generally want to live in a world that avoids pain. We're taught to smile through the struggle, to say, I'm fine, even when we're falling apart inside. And often, and sadly, within the church, we often follow suit. It's not something we talk about a lot. Many of us feel uncomfortable expressing our grief, our doubt, or our complaint to God. Maybe we feel as if faith leaves no room for sorrow. But the Bible tells a very different story. The Psalms in particular are filled with the language of lament, prayers that are born out of pain. In fact, nearly 40% of the Psalms are laments. And I'm pleased Brian got the right one, otherwise it wouldn't have worked so well this morning. These Psalms, they're not polite, filtered prayers, but they're raw cries of anguish, grief, frustration, and longing. Many of you will know that a number of years ago I lived in Suriname for 3 years, running a children's home there. And during my time there, one of the staff members, Jean, her mum passed away quite unexpectedly. And I went to the funeral to support Jean and her family, and I went with one of my colleagues, Anya, who was a Salvation Army officer and was working at the home part-time with me. And we attended the service, and then we all gathered at the cemetery around the grave. And as the casket was lowered into the grave, Jean began to wail and howl. And I've never heard anything like it. It was just this guttural, raw, deep grief that just poured out of her. And it was loud, and I felt uncomfortable. And it went on, and even once people started to move away, Jean just stood there so broken, so wounded. And I could feel Anya beside me getting a little upset about this. And eventually she said, it's enough. And she marched up to Jean. She said, Sister Jean, genoeg, which is enough in Dutch. She took her by the shoulders. She said, wipe those tears away. And she literally wiped the tears off Jean's face. She said, you have to be strong. Your mama is in heaven. Now you need to be strong for your family. And then she marched off. I was quite taken aback. I mean, I felt uncomfortable watching and experiencing this grief of Jean's, but I was very taken aback by Anya's response. And yet, as I reflect on it now, it was simply the response of someone who felt out of place and uncomfortable, and who perhaps couldn't cope with the very public and outward-facing grief that Jean was experiencing. You see, so often we want to find a quick solution for grief and pain, but this can waste the opportunity that we're given in lament, to give a person permission or allow ourselves to wrestle with sorrow instead of racing through it to the end. What we discover in the Psalms is that lamenting is not a sign of spiritual weakness. It's a bold act of faith and worship. God invites us to come as we are, hurting, doubting, weeping, even wailing. He welcomes our honesty, our struggle, and our tears. As a musician, I often think of laments as life in a minor key, just like you're hearing now. Minor keys carry this emotional weight. There's depth there, there's tension, there's an expression of longing, grief, and unresolved ache in a way that major keys simply can't express. And yet even in the midst of that ache and sorrow, there is beauty. Most of us, however, prefer the major key moments in life. Bright, upbeat, everything resolved the way it's supposed to be. Joyful times. But real life isn't always composed that way, is it? Sometimes the melody of our life dips into the shadows, And lament is the sacred soundtrack for those moments. Lament is how we live between grief and hope, between the brokenness of the world and the goodness of God. Lament gives us a way to cry out without letting go of trust. It teaches us to grieve as believers, with honesty and with hope. If you're anything like me, when you're struggling, you may well find yourselves turning to the Psalms for comfort or a way of expressing yourself to God. The psalmists are shameless in their pain. They are open and honest before God in a way that I suggest most of us would feel uncomfortable with. We read statements such as these from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. Psalm 38, my guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy to bear. I am feeble and utterly crushed. I groan in anguish of heart. Or Psalm 88, I am overwhelmed with troubles and my life draws near to death. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. We see here that lament is lived out in the raw, unresolved, minor key moments of life. And what we'll discover is that lament is not a detour from faith, it is faith. Now we see that there's a very clear framework for lament. There are 4 powerful steps that lead us from hopelessness to hope. And so looking at Psalm 13, which, as Brian said, was written by King David, and it's a beautiful example of this framework. The first thing we see is that lament begins with one courageous move, and that's turning toward God in our pain. Psalm 13 opens with these striking words, O Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? Raw, honest, prayerful lament resists the temptation to go silent or walk away from God. David doesn't retreat or shut down. Instead, he turns and he directs his grief toward God. And sometimes the most faithful thing that we can do is to keep talking to God, even if you're mad at him, even when your heart is breaking. Lament invites us to bring our hearts to God as they really are, not as we think they should be. Your pain doesn't have to push you away from God. Lament shows you how it can lead you to him when you simply turn to him in your pain. Once we've turned to God, lament invites us to bring our complaints to him. Verse 2 says, how long must I struggle with anguish in my soul, with sorrow in my heart every day? Now, complaining isn't something we normally think of as being particularly biblical or spiritual. But biblical complaint is very different to the everyday, ordinary complaining that sometimes we're all guilty of. This is honest, faithful protest that flows from the belief that God hears us even when he feels distant. Lament names pain clearly. It brings sorrow and confusion to God, while at the same time holding God to his promises and refusing to let suffering silence us. It shows us that grief and anger and our questions belong in God's presence. So this morning I'd encourage you not to hold back, to speak your sorrow, to let complaint open the way to deeper hope. But importantly, lament doesn't end with complaint. This third step, ask, moves towards bold, faith-filled requests, inviting us to ask God to act based on who he is and what he's promised. Verse 3 says, "Turn and answer me, O Lord my God. Restore the sparkle to my eyes, or I will die." David doesn't wait for the answers before he asks for help. His boldness comes from knowing God's character and past faithfulness. Our trials, the tough times of life that we all experience, can become platforms for dependence on God when we choose to call on Him in faith. I wonder what daunting need may be staring you down today. Whatever it is, can I encourage you to ask and to keep asking? Don't stop at complaint. God invites bold prayers. He's listening and He is able. And the fourth step is to trust. You see, lament doesn't end with sorrow. It leads to trust. It turns from asking why and where are you and how long, and instead it focuses on the who God is. And even when nothing changes outwardly, lament can shift our hearts. And it's interesting to see that every lament in the Psalms, except for Psalm 88, ends with a declaration of trust and hope. And in this one, David says, "Yet I trust in your unfailing love. I will rejoice because you have rescued me. I will sing to the Lord because He is good to me." David's pain hasn't changed. It's still there. But what has changed is his posture. He chooses to turn to God. He chooses to trust, not because it's easy, but because he knows that God is faithful. And I love how he starts, "Yet I trust." These little words like yet and but and therefore and however are often found in lament psalms and are often used to mark a turning point. It's like a little pivot. And we see that struggle and trust are not opposites. We can have a broken heart and raised hands at the same time. So it's important in our times of lament that they end in trust and hope and anticipation that God is good, that He is true, and that He cares. When Jules preached a few weeks ago, she introduced us to Strawn Coleman, who wrote a book, Beholding. And he writes in that book, "Our pain isn't a barrier, it's a gift. If we'll allow it, pain can actually drive us directly into a divine experience of God in our deep self. The deeper and more powerful the ache, the greater and more profound the possibility of experiencing God there is." This morning I want to encourage you to let your pain move you, not into despair, but into a deeper dependence on the God who holds you fast. We're going to take a very quick look at 3 Old Testament characters who show us how to wrestle with God through lament. The first one was Job, and his was really a prayer of protest. Job was one who prayed deep prayers of lament. Many of you will know the story. He'd lost everything. His children had died, his friends were gone, his home was destroyed, his crops and animals, his livelihood was gone, his health suffered. And after sitting in grief for 7 days, Job finally speaks. And he begins by cursing the day of his birth, saying, "Let the day of my birth be erased." He's saying, it would have been better if I'd never been born. And what follows thereafter are 25 verses of utter despair, soul-level honesty, raw, unfiltered pain, where Job repeatedly curses the day of his birth, and longs for death. And he declares he cannot eat, his groans pour out of him like water. He confirms his worst fears have happened, and he finishes by saying he has no peace, no quietness, no rest, only trouble. And throughout the subsequent chapters of the book of Job, he continues to wrestle with God through his pain, but always clinging to him as he seeks meaning to his struggles. And what I find interesting is at the end of the book, God condemns Job's friends who weren't very helpful at all, but God says that Job spoke rightly about him. And I love that, because even though Job has accused and wrestled and questioned, God says, you've done the right thing. And for us, it's validation that God invites us to come to him in our wrestling and struggling. And ultimately, Job chooses not to let God go. And there's a beautiful verse in chapter 19 where Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet, there's that word, yet in my flesh I will see God. He was able to see God in a far deeper way than before his trials. And in the end, God gave him back so much more. In fact, he blessed him twofold in the latter part of his life. Habakkuk was another Old Testament character, a prophet, but also a questioner. His book, the book of Habakkuk, which is a word that I really love to say, Habakkuk. His book opens not with a proclamation as maybe you would expect the book of a prophet to do, but literally with the title, A Complaint to God. And Habakkuk says, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Habakkuk is deeply troubled by the injustice he sees in his nation. Violence, corruption, and evil seem to flourish unchecked. He's confused and frustrated that God appears silent and inactive, and he doesn't hold back. I'd encourage you to read some of these books in your own time. He accuses God of tolerating wrongdoing, and he questions why the wicked seem to triumph. And yet, even as he protests, he keeps talking to God. And through Habakkuk's prayer of lament, God changes his heart. He didn't change his situation, but God directed his attention to his long-range plans and not the present circumstances that he found himself in. He told Habakkuk to wait and to live by faith. And by the end of the book, this prophet who began in protest and complaint ends in praise, declaring that even if all else fails, he will still rejoice in the Lord. Habakkuk 3:17, very well-known verses, say, though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Saviour. Again, nothing in Habakkuk's situation had improved. There was no breakthrough, there was no miracle, there was no happy ending at that time, and yet he chose joy. Not because life was good, but because God was good. And the final character, Jeremiah. If anyone knew how to lament, it was the prophet Jeremiah. He was often referred to as the weeping prophet. His life and ministry were marked by a deep sorrow and persistent faithfulness in the midst of despair. Jeremiah lived through the darkest period of Judah's history, the destruction of Jerusalem, the fall of the temple, and the exile of God's people. Everything that represented God's presence and promise seemed to be crumbling. And in the ashes of this catastrophe, Jeremiah gives voice to the anguish of a people broken by judgment and grief. The Book of Lamentations, again, is a raw and poetic outpouring of communal suffering and sorrow. And in its pages, we hear the cries of a prophet who feels abandoned, unheard, and crushed. He says, I'm the man who's seen affliction. He's led me into darkness, shutting out all light. He's turned his hand against me again and again. Peace has been stripped away, and I've forgotten what prosperity is. I cry out, my splendour is gone. Everything I had hoped for from the Lord is lost. Again, these aren't distant, objective observations. Jeremiah is stepping fully into his pain. He names it, he weeps over it, and he allows the full weight of loss to be felt. And then, in the middle of his lament, we find one of the most stunning declarations of hope in the entire Bible. Yet, I still dare to hope. When I remember this, the faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh. Each morning I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will hope in him. In the midst of the ruins, Jeremiah allows his lament to lead him toward the character of God. He doesn't deny the devastation, he laments it fully. Our laments, too, can become sacred spaces where sorrow and faith meet, where tears are not wasted, but are woven together in trust. I began with the story of Jean and how she was told to pull herself together and essentially get over her grief. And I want to finish by sharing a different story of pain being embraced and validated. It was the day of my dad's funeral. And as a family, we were at the cemetery preparing to bury him. We'd had a beautiful service, which included many of the grandkids sharing their memories of their papa. Some of them freely shed tears as they shared, but one of my nephews, William, who was about 10 at the time, very happily and positively recounted his memories of papa, which included his paintings, his hugs, frequent trips to the park, and the treats that he always had stashed away for them. But as Dad's casket was lowered into the grave, the reality of what was happening hit William so hard he began to sob. Not as loudly as Jean, but it was deep sobs. One of his cousins, a couple of years older than he was, went over and simply put her arm around him, stood there with him, told him it was okay to cry, and reminded him of what a wonderful papa he had been. I think that's a picture of what God does for us in the midst of our brokenness. He invites us to come as we are. He reminds us it's okay to feel the way that we feel. And he comforts us while gently reminding us of the hope that we have in him. I realise this has been a pretty heavy topic this morning. And I recognise that not everyone will be in a season of lament as such. But maybe today that is exactly where you're at. You might be in a Job season, where your prayers simply sound more like protest than praise. Can I encourage you to keep praying? Job's honesty did not disqualify him from God's presence. It drew God into the conversation. You might be in a Habakkuk moment where all you have are questions. Know this morning God welcomes them. Habakkuk didn't get all the answers he wanted, but he found a deeper trust. Or you might feel like Jeremiah in Lamentations, surrounded by sorrow and unsure where hope fits. Like Jeremiah, you can grieve and still say, yet I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. Musician Michael Card says this: "It seems to me that we do not need to be taught how to lament, since we have so many models in Scripture. What we need is simply the assurance that it's okay to lament. We all carry deep within ourselves a pressurized reservoir of tears. It takes only the right key at the right time to unlock them. In God's perfect time, those tears can be released to form a healing flood. Even if you're not in a full-on season of lament, I'm sure that if we're honest, we'd all admit there are things to lament over. Life is full of sorrow. We live in a broken world. And I suspect we all have an area of pain that God is inviting us to talk to him about through lament. Maybe it's a loved one who's struggling, a situation you want to respond to but don't know how, a destructive attitude that you simply can't shake. Maybe it's the state of our broken world, an unrealised dream, a life that hasn't gone as you planned, a long-term health issue that you struggle with, a child who's chosen a destructive path, the loss of a loved one, and the list goes on. This morning we want to create room for reflection and lament. As I said at the start, it's not something we do very often, even within the church. But knowing that God invites us to bring our pain to him, to lay out our complaints, and to ask boldly, leads us to a place of choosing to trust in him.